Snow has a way of simplifying the world. It flattens detail into a single soft color and gives every small thing a sharper outline. Footprints become declarations, breath hangs like lantern smoke, and the landscape reads as a prelude. On such an evening, a cottage sat with its eaves powdered in white, a low plume of scented steam drifting from the lean-to where herbs hung to dry, a single lantern burned by the porch. Its light pooled on the threshold and warmed the hanging bundles into amber silhouettes. From the lane came the faint tap of an occasional traveler's boot and the muffled sound of wind against dry branches. Otherwise, the world felt compact and private, as if the night were being considered. Inside, the herbalist moved through a quiet choreography the cottage had known for years. She moved as one who had learned to make small things last, mending, folding, replacing what wear had loosened. Her hands were steady and practiced. They spoke a language of their own. Jars sounded when set down, lids clicked to confirm, and the low, steady simmer of a cauldron kept the kitchen's nearer air soft with vapor. There was no hurry. All the work she did seemed, in some small way, an argument against the speed and forgetfulness of the wider world. Her name was Eleanor. She kept the cottage's books neat in a small scarred ledger tied with twine. She marked the jars with tags whose ink had the slightly brownish stain of long use. Her cat, Pip, followed her movements with a patient, purring attention, kneading the rugs as if to press the memory of warmth into them. A narrow window caught the lantern's glow and threw it against the nearest shelf, where labeled jars stood in ranks. The labels read in careful, looped script. Scented names, color notes, and a stray few entirely of the sort that belonged to the telling of stories rather than the ledger of facts. The herbs had names that belonged to an old way of thinking. Bright-leaved sprigs, called moonbitter for their silvery undersides, astringent-smelling twists called hearth-thyme, and bundles of soft green that smelled faintly of citrus and linen. Eleanor treated them like guests. She greeted them as she measured nothing, and she set them by the cauldron as if seating them at a table. The cottage itself was not merely a place in which she worked, it had a temperament. The hearth had been built low, so that when the blaze was kindled, it warmed knees and wooden floors rather than the rafters, and the beam over the fireplace was carved with a name long since worn to a gray whisper. The shelves were crowded with jars, every label a neat promise. Drawers held bits of ribbon, old buttons, a handful of brass hooks, and a small collection of paper slips with pressed petals tucked away. Each slip an anecdote of a kindness, a recipe for comfort remembered. A little instruction such as, lay warm, do not chatter, or do not let the night take the thread. Near the door hung a curtain, heavy and patched, woven in several different cloths. It separated the kitchen from the outer room, a soft threshold that was as much about invitation as it was about keeping the cold at bay. Eleanor moved with a hand to the curtain, feeling its weight. It had once been whole and new. Now it bore a tear near the hem, a mouth small enough to be dismissed but large enough, she thought, to draw attention. Small tears in thresholds mattered. A threshold that gaped let in not only draught but impatience. It invited the weather and the errand, the things one would rather leave at the lane. Repair was not merely a practical matter for Eleanor. It was an ethical, almost ritual act. To stitch a tear was to say that one would welcome what came through the door and attend to it, not turn it away. The tear needed a careful hand, a patch of the right color, thread waxed to glide without snarling. The cauldron, too, made its small declarations. It had been with her for many winters, heavy and oaken, rim blackened by use and time, its belly showing the faint lines where the fire had kissed metal. Tonight the simmer sounded attentive and safe, but when she leaned in to lift the lid for a moment, she noticed a whisper of light at the rim, a hairline fissure that had not been there the night before. It was hardly more than a seam, an oldness that had taken the shape of a crack. Not catastrophic, she thought, but significant. A vessel used often will tell you when it asks for help. If its rim speaks of stress, then it is time to listen. The herbs above the cauldron released a scent of citrus peel and black tea and something sweeter, the wintry, resinous smell like a memory of pine. Eleanor closed the lid with a soft hand, listening to the implausible steadiness of the kitchen for a long breath. There are certain evenings on which a cottage feels like a small theater for the communal life, a place where duties meet, where neighbors bring news, where apprentices learn an art of attention. Tonight promised to be one of those evenings. The tearing of the curtain and the fissure in the cauldron's rim were small things that asked, in their own language, for the community's hands. A hole in a curtain is never simply a hole. It is an invitation. If this sort of evening appeals to you, if the slow, careful work and the hush of shared labor feel like something you would like to come back to, then stay a while. There will be more to the night than the kitchen's warmth. The cottage will open, and so will a small circle of people who, in mending the object, find themselves mended. Eleanor set aside the ledger and took a scrap of beeswax from its drawer, warming it on her palm until it glowed faintly and pliant. Her apprentices arrived often on such evenings, bringing with them the kind of hunger that was not for food alone, but for the small, patient work of learning. 2 came now. Lena, who had only been with Eleanor a season, and approached every task with a furrowed brow and a hopeful eagerness. And Thomas, who had been apprenticed elsewhere before drifting across the moor and discovering that his hands enjoyed quieter things. They came in, dropping their caps on a peg and shaking snow from shoulders. Pip darted between them, tail a flag of approval. "Have you seen the curtain?" Lena asked almost at once, peering at the hem. Her breath clouded the air, and she rubbed her palms together. She had a voice like warmed earth, soft, eager, a little unsure. "It will teach you the patience of a stitch," Eleanor said, smiling without mockery. "First, learn to pick a patch whose colors'll read as an old friend. You can't make a new seam pretend to be an old one." She put out 2 bowls of tea. Not that anyone could be said to need tea for warmth alone. This was a ritual of deliberate deceleration. The steam lifted and mixed with the herb scent, and for a moment all 3 of them watched it go. The cottage's door opened again, admitting the neighbor with a crate of preserved pears and a careful grin. Nessa tended the nearby garden in summer, and brought sprigs in winter, the stems still smelling of the cold field. Her fingers were ringed and stained with sap, even in the deep hush of snow. "Thought you might like these," she said, setting down the crate, the jars clicking like a small chorus. "And a bit of this." She unfurled a small bundle of twigs tied with elderberry string. "From the greenhouse. Thought they might do for taggings, or a pinch of cheer." She caught sight of the curtain's tear and gave a small whistle. "Ah, it'll only be a thing if we let it be. Bring your thread, girl," she said to Lena. "Use that thick spool from the back drawer. It'll do well enough." Shortly after, Jory, the carpenter, arrived with his satchel of tools. He smelled of shavings and varnish, a pleasant, clean scent. He was big-handed, and had a laugh that rumbled like a dropped plank. He set his shoulder against the door frame as though testing the weight of the winter. "Anything broken?" he asked, scanning the room with the quick eye of someone who notices how light strikes a groove more than the rest. Eleanor showed him the cauldron's rim, and, with the casual, reverential tone one uses for objects that have seen winters, he bent his head to peer. "It's a seam," he agreed. "A pinch here and there, and it'll be sound enough. Bring me a thin strip of oak, if you have one, to take the strain off the rim. Something flexible." He did not ask for instructions, but for the material. The knowledge that the right piece of wood, planed and fitted, was more important than elaborate fixes. Bramwell came last, as though the night had saved the best for its final breath. He was the elder of the lane, an old man whose anecdotes collected like leaves. He had a slow, steady way of speaking that made listeners lean in by habit. He set his stick aside and sat in the second chair by the hearth. In his hands he unwrapped a small parcel of bread and cheese he had brought, his face pleased at the domesticity of it all. They settled, making a small ring around the kitchen table. The work that would follow was not merely practical, it would be pedagogical. Repair, in this cottage, was a way to teach the apprentices about attention. The measures would be measured in patience, not in minutes, and each correction would be given gently, as one who tended young plants rather than chided wayward shrubs. Eleanor took a moment to catalogue what might be required. It was useful, she thought, to be thorough. The old cauldron might yield to a sympathetic rib of wood. The torn curtain could be patched, perhaps with a hand-stitched mend that did not attempt to hide its story, but rather acknowledged it. The herb sacks, one had a frayed seam, could be reshaped and their labels repaired. There was, too, a thin strip of torn paper that had slipped out of an old drawer. Perhaps that had held a note once and would deserve a place in the ledger if found. They moved through the kitchen like birds moving through a room at dusk, purposeful, certain of each tiny landing. Jory set his tools on the table with a care that bordered on ceremony. He selected a plane and a small block of oak, and the motion of planing began, the shavings spiraling off in curls that were, for a moment, a small celebration of material. Each shaving gathered a thin line of light where it caught the lantern. Delicate, ribbon-like, ephemeral as the breath between two words. Eleanor and the apprentices watched how Jory held the plane, his hands well positioned, his foot set, his back carrying the balance. Lena tried to copy the motion and found her shavings rougher, chunkier. Thomas, who prided himself on his steadier work, managed a long curl that made Jory nod in small approval. Meanwhile, Eleanor set up her own station. She drew out the beeswax, a spool of thread, pins, and patches of cloth in several tones that matched the curtain's familiar palette. There was no hurry to match precisely. The idea was to make the repair read as itself while honoring the curtain's history. She cut a small swatch of fabric and ran a finger over its weave. Each stitch would be done in the cottage's own rhythm. Not rushed, but not ornamental either. The stitches would hold, and they would show. The apprentices fumbled. Lena's first knot was too tight and puckered the fabric. She unpicked it with eyes that glistened the way a child's do at the brink of a new skill. Eleanor did not take the needle from her, but placed a hand over Lena's for a moment, letting her feel the right tension. That was the apprenticeship. Correction by touch, guidance by proximity, instruction whispered rather than declared. Thomas set about smoothing a strip of oak with more confidence than he had shown 2 days prior. Jory set him to rasping the edge until it sat true. It took several tries to find a rib that would take the cauldron's weight and cradle the lip without chafing the metal. They worked in layers. Trial, correction, small success. Pause. Reattunement. Bramwell offered stories between tasks. He did not demand to be heard. His tales entered the room like the softest kind of weather. Once, in his telling, a traveling potter had come with a cracked jug and left with a full hearth and a night's lodging in exchange for teaching a child to shape clay. Another time, he remembered a seam in a shoemaker's boot that, once mended, allowed the wearer to keep walking through a long winter. Each anecdote was brief and wound back to the theme at hand. Repair is the thread that joins one life to another. The apprentices listened, more to the cadence of his voice than the specific events. Bramwell's stories functioned as a kind of shadow instruction. How to listen to the history of an object, how to honor its scar. As the evening drew on, the tasks multiplied in small ways. Linen sacks demanded their seams be strengthened. Labels required kneading and reinforcing with strips of paper pasted to the underside so that the ink would not smudge. Eleanor kept a small pot of adhesive, nothing more than a tacky old way of saying, "Be careful." And she instructed that labels be considerably redundant. 2 or 3 places to find the same name so that nothing became truly lost. The apprentices learned to fold labels just so. They smoothed the paper down and watched it take to the jar like a shy thing finding its voice. There was a moment, mid-repair, when the cauldron made a small sound, less a groan than the settling of an old house. It drew every head. Eleanor walked to it, placed her palm on the rim, and listened as if it could speak. For a second she regarded the hairline fissure anew, considering whether a rib alone would suffice or whether a stronger intervention would be needed. Jory spoke of a clamp used long ago by his father, a gentle device that took strain without shaming the metal. He considered whether the rib might be lashed with thin brass to spread the strain. The cottage's oddments had a small chest of brass rings and wire that Rowan, the neighbor with oddments, often brought. The plan was not yet decided, and that uncertainty sat like a small, careful thought in the air. They paused then for supper. Food in the cottage was practical, but made with pride. Slices of bread warmed, pickled root vegetables, jars of preserved pears from Nessa, a pot of stew that gave off faint, comforting steam. They ate in a companionable way, the talk moving from task to this and that. The apprentices asked practical questions. How long had Eleanor been keeping the ledger? Where had Jory learned to plane so evenly? And the answers were given in the manner of people whose life was woven from small decisions. Eleanor did not rehearse a life. She let the explanations fall like measured stones. Bramwell told a short story about a seamstress who embroidered a map of the moon into the hem of a child's coat. It made them all laugh softly, and then fall quiet as if thinking the better of laughter. Outside, the snow made a small, persistent sound against the window, a whisper of the wider weather. After supper, they returned to their work. Lena's stitches became more even. Tomas's smoothing took on a patience. They spoke less and listened more, as if something in the room had asked for that economy of voice. The shavings from the plane lay in a gentle pile, and Jory fashioned a thin oak rib to the cauldron's dimensions. They could have done the whole job quickly, in a single motion, but it was not the way here. Each step was taken slowly to multiply the lesson. Eleanor bent the rib to the curve the metal asked for, and fitted it with a tenderness that made the others pause. At one point, Rowan appeared at the door with a crate of odds, and a grin that suggested he had found treasure where others had seen rubbish. He carried a small box of brass rings, a coil of thin wire, and a handful of discarded, doubtless useful things. He set them on the table with an artful clatter. "You never know what'll be useful till it's needed," he said, as though saying it were an aphorism. He helped thread a ring into a thong and handed it over without fuss. The trainees found themselves relying on their neighbor as much for humor as for hardware. As the night thickened, Eleanor suggested they make a small ritual of the mending. Not a ceremony that would pretend to be more than it was, but a mannered attention that acknowledged the labor and the object's history. "We will not pretend these things were never broken," she said softly, "but neither will we let them define what comes next." The apprentices murmured assent and resumed their tasks. At the cauldron, the rib was fitted into place. Jory and Thomas worked in a synchrony that spoke of practice, one holding steady, the other tapping gently. A nail here, a little compression there. They used a strip of cloth as a buffer so that the metal wasn't cracked by the wood as it settled, and for a time the work seemed to go as planned. The cat wove through their legs and demanded a pat, and Pip's contented purr became part of the room's chorus. They tightened, tested, and then let the cauldron stand for a good while. Eleanor poured a warming cup of tea and set it by the hearth, watching the steam rise in its own small, patient dance. Yet the fisher had a mind of its own. When they returned to consider whether the rib held, a hair-thin line had loosened again, like the memory of a wound shifting at certain tides. It was not so that the fix had failed. Rather, the fix required another layer of attention, something that would secure not only the metal, but the trust the cottage had in that metal. The apprentices felt the small pressure of not simply finishing the job, but doing it in such a way that the cauldron would continue to be honored, that the repair would be visible, and that it should, if anything, tell its own story. Bramwell, sensing a narrative moment, told of a night when he had stitched a seam into a shepherd's coat and found a coin sewn into the lining. A letter of apology, wrapped and kept safe. "A repair is sometimes a good place for secrets," he said, tapping the table. "It keeps them safe and gives them company." There was a tiny laugh from Lena as she imagined secrets tucked into hems. It eased the pressure around the cauldron's rim, if only for a moment. Night deepened. The lanterns were banked to keep the light comfortable, not glaring. Outside, the snow lay in small, oblivious undulations, and beyond the hedgerow the lane showed no new tracks. Inside, the cottage hummed with small activity. Jory had a plan. A thin brass band, hammered gently and set to sit against the rib, would take the last of the strain. He drew on Rowan's coil, and the metal rang soft and true under his hammer. Thomas held the rim while Lena passed patches and pins, and Eleanor offered corrections. What to watch for in the way thread lay against metal, which motions to avoid so that the stitch did not become an act of violence. They worked in a silence that felt more like a listening. The stranger arrived at dusk. It began as a faint tapping at the door, almost polite in its insistence. The cottage stilled as if the hearth had been asked to hush. Bramwell was first to his feet. The apprentices followed with a curiosity that had the hunger of proper novices. Eleanor wiped her hands and moved as though to find the door-appropriate clothing, the patch of an apron, a steady belief that a cottage offers what it has. She opened the door. A woman stood there, rain-threaded hair, cheeks bright from the cold, a small parcel wrapped in oiled cloth clutched against her chest. Her coat was well-traveled. Its patches were the language of a life that had walked long. She looked as if she carried the world's weather about her. For a long, silvered second, the cottages' faces measured her and found her unsuspicious. The night outside frames every arrival as an event. The presence of a stranger becomes a test of what thresholds are for. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice hushed and respectful at once. Eleanor stepped back and lifted the curtain. The torn hem caught the light and showed the work that had been begun. The woman's fingers brushed the torn fabric without hesitation. She looked at the cauldron and the gathered people, and then at the parcel she had brought. In it, as the cottage would come to learn if the evening allowed, lay a small folded letter and a coin that had seen far roads. There was a little pause, a soft suspension of the room's earlier motion. The apprentice's curiosity tightened. Bramwell's smile softened into something like caution. Jory's hands paused on a strip of brass, mid-turn. The cottage had to decide whether to open its threshold truly and invite the traveler inside. The torn curtain and the fissured cauldron were small matters of repair, but they dovetailed with a deeper question. What did hospitality mean when one's resources were counted in spare cloth and small tools rather than coin? To take someone in was to promise a night's warmth and a portion of the cauldron's contents. It was also to accept the unpredictability that traveling people bring. Eleanor considered quietly, and then asked the woman to step in. There is risk in opening a threshold. There is also the quiet ethics of a door that remembers the people who once sheltered a potter or a wayfarer. The woman crossed the threshold, one foot then the other, as if stepping into a new chapter of a book she'd half expected but not hoped for. So the cottage received her. She shook off the wet at the door where Eleanor set a mat and offered tea, and she peeled back the parcel with hands that trembled only a little. She would not, they all agreed, without a word, be left in the kitchen's corner. Their hospitality was not careless but deliberate. The apprentices stood back as if to make room for the adult moving that does not require instruction. Bramwell produced a slice of bread as if from cunning and set it beside her. Nessa fetched a jar with little more ceremony than she would take from a cupboard. They sat. The stranger, whose name was Mira, told a little of why she had come. That she had been traveling for weeks, that she carried a parcel with a folded note addressed to some far-off friend, that the road had been unkind of late. She spoke plainly, without overshare, and the cottage listened. Yet her presence also revealed something tucked in the parcel, a scrap of cloth with a stitch similar to the one forming in the curtain's hem, a sign that perhaps her story stitched near to theirs. Outside, the wind shifted. The cauldron trembled in its new embrace and gave a small, uncertain clink that sounded like a thought. The rib held for the moment, the brass band sat in its place, and the cat resumed its circling, satisfied for once. Lena sat with needle in hand and watched how Eleanor touched the woman's sleeve, and then handed her a cup. There was a quiet, passing warmth in that gesture that felt like a benediction. As they shared the kitchen's light and the small quietness belonging to friendly strangers, someone noticed that the patch on the curtain's wrong side bore a different thread from the rest. A deliberate, bright stitch, as though to say, "This is a seam, and it is not ashamed to look like one." Bramwell told another story, this time of a seam where two hands had stitched a map across a blanket so that a child could find their way back home. It seemed fitting. At the table, Mira unfolded a letter, slow and deliberate. The edges of the paper had been kissed by rain. The writing was neat and taut. She read only a line aloud before folding it back to herself and smiling in a way that suggested gratitude folded into secrecy. The coin she produced was old, a little shiny at its edges from many pockets. She left it on the table not as payment. Hospitality was not measured in such accounts, but as an offering. A fragment of her travels left in their keeping. Work had paused, but not for long. There was a shared sense that the tasks of the evening remained. The curtain needed finishing. The cauldron asked for a final tendering. The herb sacks were to be made whole. Yet the arrival had tilted the room's purpose just enough that the repair of objects felt entwined now with the repair one might offer a traveler. A bowl of warmth, a place to dry, a page of listening. The apprentices felt the weight of this. They had come to learn stitches and planes, and were steadily discovering that their lessons included the art of receiving. It was well into the night when a new sound came. Not the usual settling groans of a house, nor the careful corner of fork on plate, but distant, firm footsteps on the lane. Through the narrow window a shape could be seen. Another traveler, perhaps, or a neighbor delayed, or merely the mind's own imagining. The lantern's light flared when the door swung. For a moment, the cottage's small world held its breath and waited to see what the lane would offer next. The cat froze mid-purr. The apprentices straightened, hands on tools as if to stand ready. Eleanor, who had been thinking of stitches and the ethics of thresholds all evening, glanced at the torn hem and the cauldron's seam, as though looking at two small problems that had multiplied into a single question. How do we keep our doors open and still tend what is ours to mend? The knock at the outer gate, when it finally came, was deliberate. 3 light taps, a rhythm that might have been learned on many doors. The cottage listened, and the night outside seemed to answer. The figure at the gate was not yet close enough to be certain. For a breath that took up all the room, every hand in the kitchen found its place and every ear inclined. The mending had begun, but not yet ended. The traveler had been welcomed, but had not yet taken her leave. The fissure at the cauldron's rim remained a thought at the back of their minds, and the torn curtain threaded the evening like a question. They moved then, some to the door, some to the cauldron, some to calm a startled Pip who had leapt at the sound. Each action a partial resolution of a different thread. The hour was late, and the snow outside had gained weight in the dim. The wave of the night pressed them together. The cottage was warm and tight and full of small intentions. The cat rubbed against Eleanor's ankle, as if to remind her of the ordinary amid the uncertain. Inside, someone reached for a candle and set it where its light would make the stitches clear. The apprentices drew closer to see how the rib sat against the rim, how the brass band cupped it. Lena's fingers trembled at first, but steadying under Eleanor's gaze, she prepared to continue the stitch at the curtain. Tomas inhaled, and returned to his rasping with a renewed patience. The stranger Mira watched them with a quiet concentration, her parcel now set to one side like a sleeping thing. Beyond the threshold, new footfalls approached, and the lane's sound suggested either another person or only the house's own imagining. The moment held, a pause in which the cottage awaited the world's next small offering. The planed shavings lay like confetti. The brass rings slept in their box, and a line of thread lay by the curtain ready to be taken up. The room hummed with the expectation of more. More mending, more stories, more hands. The night was not yet finished. The fissure was not yet healed. Hospitality had been extended, but not fully reciprocated. The cottage breathed, as if itself were gathered into a single careful exhale, and the outer world tapped its palm against the door once more. The knock at the gate came again, patient, measured, and with it the small sound of boots scuffing through thawing snow. For a moment the cottage held its breath. It was as if the whole room leaned toward that sound, listening not only with its ears but with the attentive inertia of hands still smudged with flour and wood dust. Eleanor's fingers hovered above the thread she had been sorting. Lino's needle paused between her palms. Tomas set the rasp down and let the motion bleed from his shoulders. Even Pip sat still, tail curled like a question. Jory stepped to the door this time, the way he did when a plank wanted turning, or when a hinge needed testing. Slowly, as though his own weight might decide the answer. He opened it to a woman younger than Mira, cheeks wind-bright and hair knotted in a haste that suggested she had not expected to stop. In her arms she held a small, bent crate with the careful gaiety of someone who gathers lost things. A torn glove, a scrap of ribbon, a tin with a dent on one side. Behind her, a boy of perhaps 12 peered from under a hood, blue-eyed and not exactly lost, but looking for permission. "I'm sorry," the woman said in a quick, apologetic tumble. "We meant to be at the next crossroads, but the road turned strange. There's a leak in our cart, and we thought—" She gestured at the crate. "We thought you might know where to put things that need holding for a night." Inside, the cottage shifted its balance in that way homes do when they choose to receive. Eleanor stepped aside, and the torn curtain, its half-finished hem catching the lamplight, became the threshold that would judge the request. The boy's boots were wet. His gloves were damp as though he had held snow and then water the whole day. There was no great danger here, no urgent disease, no fierce need for instant rescue. Only the usual, unmistakable human weariness that such weather made plain. "Come in," Eleanor said, the word as much instruction as welcome. "Leave the crate by the hearth. We have a corner to dry things." Mira, still by the table with her parcel folded like a small secret map, offered a cloth and a smile. Nessa set down another jar with a soft clack and nodded toward the shelf where spare linens lived like patient refugees. The boy's name, when he gave it, was Hal. The woman said she was called Maeve, and that they were on their way to visit a kin some lanes over. Their cart, it turned out, needed a plank and a new lash. They had hoped for the modest intervention such a cottage could supply. This small arrival settled into the room with the ease of something that had been expected, though not planned. It gave the cottage another intention, to be a place where frayed things could be steadied, and where travelers might be warmed without fuss. The apprentices looked on with a mixture of delight and the shy hunger of true learners. It was one thing to practice stitches on a curtain by habit. It was quite another to witness those stitches hold against the weather on someone else's coat. The work resumed in a new rhythm, folded around the presence of these guests. Jory went outside to examine the cart's tongue as though his hands were a kind of weather reading. He returned with a small sliver of wood to test in the hearth's light. He did not speak of techniques as matters of formula, but of relationships. How wood answered wood if asked politely, how it took its shape when given time. He handed Hal a small shaving to look at, and let the boy's eyes follow the curl as it lay pale in the lantern glow. For Hal, who had known cruelty of lane and weather but not much of gentle craft, the experience was a new grammar. Inside, Eleanor returned to the cauldron. The fissure at the rim had widened, imperceptibly, as if it had been listening to the night and deciding how loud it might be. It made no sudden noises, only a subtle complaint that bent the kitchen's air. The work needed a finaling, a joining that would be legible but honest, a mending that the metal would accept without losing the memory of its scars. Jory and Thomas set themselves to the task with the deliberate care of people doing something that mattered, because they would be leaving a mark on the object rather than hiding it. They experimented with the brass strip again, this time wrapping it in soft linen where it would meet the metal, laying the thin oak rib so that it supported without smothering. The apprentice's first attempts made haphazard light scratches on the metal that left them red-faced with embarrassment. Eleanor's voice softened the room as she reminded them that every mark tells a story, and that shame was a needless reaction to a learning hand. Bramwell, listening from his chair, supplied a story about a potter who had once fixed a cracked bowl with a bright seam, and then signed it so the bowl might carry its repair as a crafted signature. It sent a ripple of approval through the room. The apprentice's shoulders loosened. While they worked, Eleanor moved among them like a conductor of small attentions. She smoothed linen, pressed cloth to the warmth of a brazier without giving instruction, and taught by showing the motion of a wrist, rather than by telling a method. She spoke of the duty of repair as an act of remembering. To mend was to keep a history alive and to accept responsibility for what care could be given. Lena, whose hands were often quick to seize tools and quicker still to doubt, listened and then tried again, her stitches lengthening into a steady line that read as a sentence on the curtain's hem. The neighbors, coming and going, braided with the work. Rowan contributed his small found treasures, an unusual washer, a coil of thin wire, a brass button that had the right weight and tilt to it. Nessa offered sprigs of dried herb tied with elder string, not to be brewed or taken as recipe, but as a way to freshen the air and to lend the smell of fields where the snow had been just a memory. Bramwell ate and talked, and, when silence would have sat too heavy, filled the gaps with his tales. Of a winter when a cottage fed the whole lane with nothing more than porridge and courtesy. Of an apprentice who, years on, returned with a child and a borrowed lute. By the time the second hour had folded into the third, the mending had become a choreography of repetition and slight surprises. A stitch tried in a new place would change the way a curtain hung. A shaved rib altered the silhouette of the cauldron. A brass fold caught the light and made a new, private constancy along the rim. Each act of repair carried with it a small ritual. The selection of a thread, the choice of a patch that would not pretend to be invisible, the deliberate keeping of the repair visible as a reminder both to the object and to those who would use it. These were not silent dogmas, but choices that named a way of living. At one point, Lena unpicked half a dozen stitches and began again, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She was not used to admitting error in public. Eleanor did not chide. Instead, she folded her hands around Lena's and guided the motion of the needle so gently that it felt like being steadied by another breath. "There is no end to the practice," Eleanor said, and Bramwell hummed as if to agree. "We do not pretend to perfect. We only practice being better keeps." The cauldron, under all these interventions, settled into a new patience. It no longer made that thin complaint. Instead, when they lifted the lid at last, the vapor rose and carried a faint scent of citrus and resin and some herb whose name belonged to the elder stories, the sort of name that suggested moonlight and old gardens rather than instruction. Mira watched the way the steam bent in the light, and then closed her eyes as though she could fold the memory of that smell into her pocket like a talisman. Conversation, when it strayed from tasks, turned naturally to the way mending threaded into life. Bramwell said, with his habitual flourish, that there were people who thought everything new was better. "They've not sat with a stitch that keeps you warm," he said. "They've not watched a seam bear a winter." Nessa laughed, and told of a plant that refused the greenhouse until she spoke to it gently every night. Rowan swore that His best finds were things people no longer remembered owning. The apprentices absorbed the stories as if they were seasoning. Little, unseen flavors that would make future stitches taste like more than mere wood and thread. As night wore on, the cottage folded its work into a quiet ceremony. Eleanor set an old, shallow bowl by the hearth, not as a charm, but as recognition. Where hands have labored, something should rest. They each put a finger to the rim. Little, private benedictions of gratitude, and then sat to share a modest meal. The bread was heavy, the preserved pears soft with sugar, the stew plain and honest. They ate in a way that made the space for stories and quiet confessions. Mira, whose parcel had sat quiet and unexplored for most of the evening, unwrapped the letter at last. The boy, Hal, watched with an attentiveness that would have pleased any elder. Mira read aloud a single line, and then folded the paper close as if to be rid of it, or to keep it to herself. Perhaps both. She told them, in pieces, of a childhood spent along the coast, of a woman who once gave her a needle and a piece of advice, and then vanished into the road. "I keep this coin," she said, tapping the table, "because it was left to me when I had nothing else. It's not a payment. It's a memory." "That is how it should be," Bramwell said, pleased. "Memory is a better currency than many." The night thickened and grew quieter until even the snow seemed to sleep. The cottage's warmth pressed against the windows. The hourglass on the mantel tracked a slow, dependable time. The apprentices, now soothed by food and small triumphs, drew closer to Eleanor and asked about the ledger. Eleanor smiled and opened it, not as an act of display but of trust. The ledger held names and small stories and a string of notes. Mended curtain, Lena, and rib for cauldron, Jory. It was, she said, their catalogue of care rather than an inventory. She let Lena and Thomas write their own hands into it, the act small and deeply careless in its certainty. The cottage, at that moment, felt almost hospitable to its own history. Every patch and every label seemed to hum with the small energy of purpose. Luna, the old moon, had rounded the sky, and now the lanterns were banked to a low glow, the sort that makes hands feel gentle and words sound truer than they might under harder light. Bramwell, feeling the gravity of his role as talekeeper, offered one last story before sleep. An almost true tale of a woman who had sewn a map into a coat, and how that map led not to a place but back to a person. The moral, he suggested, was that maps sometimes lead to one another. They prepared beds for the travelers, not as guests to be coddled, but as people to be trusted. Hal's bed was spread with a woolen blanket that smelled of wool and field. Maeve's coat was laid to dry near the brazier. Mira took her parcel, and, with a small nod to Eleanor, promised to stay the night and leave at first light. The apprentices tucked their tools away, the way those who have learned a lesson store their spoils. Before they slept, they gathered at the hearth in a small, quiet ritual. Eleanor lit a lantern and walked to the circle of beds, placing a folded cloth or a small sachet of dried sprig at the head of each. She explained nothing. Her motions were instruction enough. Bramwell made a loose benediction about roads and roofs and hands that know their way. The hourglass was turned for the night, an old habit that was less about timing than about marking the end of one labor and the beginning of rest. They left a cup by the cauldron, not as an offering, but as a promise. Whoever came late would find the room not empty, but graciously prepared. Morning arrived thin and silver. Snow had gathered a softer hush overnight. The lane outside was smooth and untroubled. Dawn light fell through the patched curtain in a different way now, making the new stitches glow as if they had been in place long enough to have darkened into belonging. Eleanor rose early to check the cauldron and found it steady, its seam holding like a kept confidence. Jory, with a practiced eye, sanded the last rough edge of his oak rib until the line between wood and metal pleased him. Lena came with a mug, still steaming, and Tomas had the rasp cleaned and put away in its box, his hands calm and sure. At breakfast, Maeve and Hal thanked the household with a small grace that sounded more like a map than a speech. Maeve left the crate with a wrapped plank tucked among the other goods, and an offer to return the favor when the road opened. Hal, shy and earnest, handed Lena a small dap of hand-carved wood he had kept in his pocket, a token of thanks for the steadiness of her hand. Mira, who had slept with her parcel at her side, rose and, with an air of someone whose heart had been slightly unburdened, left behind a note folded into the ledger. It read in a neat script, "For the shelf that keeps memories safe, may all your thresholds find welcome." They watched them go. First Mira, breaking the small circle of their intimacy with a smile and a wave. Then Maeve and Hal, as they set off with their repaired cart, and a new lash Jory had fitted with a kind of clumsy pride. The lane took them into a world that would always be wider than the cottage, and the cottage watched them go with the composed, benevolent eye of something that knew the meaning of "see you laters." After the travelers had gone and the lane had smoothed itself of tracks, the household returned to its ordinary labors. The cauldron was emptied, and washed with a cloth that had been used 3 times over, the way some items absorb more than water. Shelves were straightened. Labels were neatened and tagged in 2 places so a name would not be easy to lose. Bramwell hummed as he wiped a jar, and in the spaces between his humming he murmured small tales he had saved for morning, of butter that would not churn until a child sang to it, of a pair of shoes that had walked the length of a river and still kept their soles. The apprentices took these with the curious reverence of students who had been given the key to a locked drawer. Eleanor spent the afternoon making a slow circuit of the cottage's holdings. She checked which jars needed new slips of paper, set aside a selection of sprigs for the shelf where visitors might smell the seasons, and wrote a small note to pin above the workbench. This house tends what it can. Leave stories, not burdens. The act of writing was itself a stitch, she thought. A small, legible intervention. On the ledger's open page they wrote, in Eleanor's careful script, the new entries. Curtain patched. Lena, cauldron ribbed, Jory, Thomas, travelers lodged, Mira, Maeve, and Hal. Each name was a small star pinned to the cottage's memory. Bramwell added an afterthought in the margin, a short line. Stories mended here, too. Days passed with the gentle monotony that makes craft into habit. The apprentice's routine lengthened into a true apprenticeship. Lena practiced stitching visible seams on cloths destined for nothing but practice. She tore them and mended them, and then tore them again, learning how a line of thread could both hold and speak. Tomas learned to listen to a plane's voice and to pace his strokes so that the wood would give graceful curls rather than jagged chips. Jory taught them to measure with the kind of eye that sought balance rather than absolute precision. He insisted they learn to smell the shavings for the honesty in their grain. Rowan continued to appear with oddments, each one a small prompt for improvisation. Bramwell, for his part, settled into a rhythm of afternoon stories. He told them of winters when a village's heart was a single well. He told of a tailor who had stitched a name into every hem, so that if someone were to get lost, their name would find them, tucked into the seams for safekeeping. Each story was short, like a stitch, and each returned them to the theme that had become the cottage's creed. That mending connects people as much as it connects objects. In the evenings, Eleanor took to making a round of the shelves, murmuring to the jars in a voice that was almost private. She would touch a label and trace its ink, sometimes adding a blossom or a scrap of paper behind it, a slight thing that made the jar feel less solitary. Once, an apprentice asked if these acts were a kind of superstition. Eleanor smiled and replied that these were not superstitions but manners. Small courtesies extended to objects and to one another. They kept both in better temper. Weeks later, when thaw had become thawed and then remade into a new kind of weather, a traveling woman arrived bearing a small box that rattled with the sound of coins. She had heard of a cottage where hands did honest work and wanted to barter for a repaired kettle. She left somewhat of a payment, but more of a story. She had once been sewn back into a life by the intervention of a stranger with a needle and a patient hand. She left, too, with a small ring of brass that Jory accepted with a solemn nod, as if the ring had been a relic of a previous lesson. The cottage continued to be a way station for these small human economies, exchanges of bread for stories, wood for mending, a coin for a memory. It did not claim to save lives. It claimed moments of steadiness. Its magic, if one wished to call it that, was of the kind that makes a door feel warm when you lay your palm against it and know someone inside will understand the weather you have carried. Months later, the patch on the curtain had darkened at the edges and softened into its place. It no longer looked like a foreign thing sewn on. Rather, it read as the next stanza in a long poem. The cauldron, too, bore its new rib like a band of memory. When the light struck it, the brass caught and threw a modest glow that seemed to bless the hearth in an almost ridiculous way. Visitors who came years after that night would not always notice the care that had gone into those repairs. What they did notice was how the cottage welcomed them, how it tolerated their wear, and how, without fuss, it offered shelter and tea, and, if needed, a word. Eleanor watched these small continuities with a patience learned in childhood. She had, in the beginning, thought the ledger a tidy convenience. Now it felt like a map of human decency. When a stranger came with a coin and a letter, she would tuck the letter into the ledger's back pocket. When a child sang to a pot that would not churn, she allowed the child to feel the triumph of a household made better by a small victory. She taught the apprentices to be careful with names, and to honor minor mischiefs as potential stories. One evening, in the later wash of a summer that felt like an apology for winter's harshness, Lena found herself teaching a girl from the next lane how to pick a patch whose texture would read as a friend to the old weave. The girl's fingers were small and impatient, but they learned the rhythm. It was, for Lena, a strange and satisfying full circle, the moment when a student becomes a teacher in miniature. Thomas, watching from the doorway, felt a similar pleasure in the way the girl's first even stitch anchored her face into a look of concentration that worried the worry from off her brow. The cottage, through all of this, continued to exert a gentle spell. Not one of incantations and fixed outcomes, but a daily practice of care. Herbs dried above the hearth, releasing a soft and peculiar scent that made visitors breathe in as if tasting an old memory. Jars collected labels whose ink faded and was renewed. The hourglass turned again and again, marking labors and rests. The animal life. Pip, imperious and content, remained the small oracle of domestic mood, his purrs reading as approval or asking for a saucer more plainly than any human interruption. On an evening much like the first, when snow came soft and sudden, and the lane outside lay like a page without footprints, Eleanor stood by the door and watched the light through the patched curtain. She thought of the people who had passed through: Mira, Maeve, Hal, the woman with the coins, and of the apprentices who had learned that a stitch is sometimes more important than 100 neat hems. She thought of the ledger and the way names were kept, how memory trades in small, visible acts. She turned to the apprentices and, in the light that was full of soft consideration, offered a last small instruction, a manner rather than a method. "When you mend," she said quietly, "think of who will cross that threshold in the future. Not all mending is for the present. Some of it is for the people who will need to see that things can be kept." They listened as if she had named a thing they had always known and only now found the word for. Outside, a traveler's lamp bobbed on the lane, and then the light passed. Inside, a kettle sighed, and the cauldron bubbled in its calm way, smelling of citrus and resin that might mean nothing to a stranger, but everything to someone who had once been taught to measure darkness in the thickness of steam. If you have stayed with the cottage this long, perhaps you have made its quiet company a part of your evening. If you would like more such nights, more soft stories of hands and thresholds and the small economies of care, there are others still in the ledger, waiting to be read. Find them, and when you do, come back and bring your own mended things for the shelf. The house breathed in the last light of dusk. Eleanor lit the lantern, not to banish the dark, but to make it a companion. She set a cup by the cauldron for any late traveler, and turned the hourglass once more. The apprentices packed their tools and left a ribbon of wax for the drawer as a sign they had been there. Bramwell took his stick and, with a conspiratorial nod to the apprentices, hinted at a story he had been saving. A tale of a seam that led a fisherman home. They laughed softly at the thought, and then parted, the way small villages do, with goodbyes that feel like promises to return. The patch on the curtain would fade into a darkened tone. The brass on the cauldron would shine a little more where hands had tended it. Months hence, Lena would teach another child how to mend a torn sleeve. Tomas would take up a small commission to make a box for a basket. Jory would plane a new plank and think for a minute of the curl of shavings that had first taught Hal something about wood. The ledger would grow new entries, each a tiny witness to kindness. Breathe, if you will, once with me now, slow and deliberate. Feel the warmth that spreads from a hearth, the memory of a stitch held gently, the hush that comes when a house decides to be kind. Let the sound of the cauldron's gentle simmer be a small metronome for your own pace. Not urgent, not idle, but steady. When you are ready, carry that calm with you. Visit the Herbalist's notebook for more evenings like this, more small ceremonies of mending and welcome, and subscribe if you would like to keep finding houses that open their doors in slow, human ways. The cottage will be here, tending its jars and its ledger, keeping a place for those who walk in from the weather.